today. We are just over halfway through our second book, and of course, you know, this means the nice weather outside also means that we're coming close to the end of semester. So we just have three more weeks of regular classes, and then we have that fourth week is our final exam. So remembering that the format of that exam is the same as for the midterm, right? So 2 essay questions. I'll give you the essay questions ahead of time, just like last time. You can have a page of notes just like last time. You can bring in your book just like last time. So those skills that you and strategies that you learned from last time, also put those into practice. Okay, so as we've done before, thankfully this time I remembered to attach the PowerPoint so that we can see it a little more clearly. So today, as I've done before, I have a quick synopsis, overview of what happened in the story, and then I want to pick out some key ideas and passages for us to look at. Okay, so in our reading for today, where we left off was we saw Olivier, remembering that Olivier is sort of like the protege, the guy who's protected by Ciccani and works for Ciccani. Well, he has an equivalent, right? Remember, Ciccani's rival is Cardinal Dodot, is how you say his name, right? And Cardinal Dodot also has a guy that works for him, and his chief errand boy, worker, etc. And that guy is Altier, right? So these two guys, they meet up, right? And they meet at an inn, and they, spend some time having fun, drinking, talking. And Altier, we see, warns Olivier, watch out, there's some soldiers, they're sent by my cardinal to stop you, right? I'm your friend, so I'm going to try and help you. But we see that this situation is a little more complicated than it appears. Anyway. So Altier and Olivier, they talk, they go on, we see some of their conversation, they talk about Manlius's ideas. And remember, Olivier tells him about the cobbler who was able to quote from Manlius, even though like Manlius, his manuscript had been lost for a long time. And then Altier says, oh, that reminds me of a story, right? Reminds me of a story when I met the current Pope, Pope Clement. Now, those of you who are not familiar with this, but it's convention when a pope, when they become the pope, is that they usually take on a new name, right? So, so the pope changes his name when it's the convention. So the current pope, remember, he chose to be Pope Francis, right? That was not his name before, right? So it's convention. So Pope Clement is not like the given name of the Pope. That's just the name that he chose, right? So his real name before that was the name that he was given at birth was Pierre Roger. And so Altier remembers, oh yeah, back when I met the Pope, way back before he was the Pope, I remember him, he was a judge in a trial of a group of Cathar heretics, right? And they were captured and they were put on trial, and they said all sorts of things about like their Neoplatonic beliefs, right? Remember we saw how the Neoplatonist belief in part was that, remember, that this world was because it's part of the multiple and not part of the supernatural beyond oneness of everything. They're like, this world doesn't matter. We don't care if we die, right? These are just our material bodies. If we die, our spirits will go up and join God. Right? So they're like, we don't care. And everyone was at the trial is shocked about this. So Olivier, when he hears about this trial, when he hears about the Cathars, he is surprised how much their views echo those of Manlius, right? That Manlius's Neoplatonism that he learns from Sophia is very similar to what he hears about the Cathars. Okay. Then in the morning, Olivier discovers that Altier had actually brought with him the plague, right? And this is the beginning of the Black Death in the novel, right? people suddenly start dying everywhere, right? There's panic, and Altier dies, and Olivier is left to bury his friend. Okay. So, knowing that there are soldiers out to get him, Olivier takes a detour, tries to escape them, but he just finds there are soldiers everywhere. So instead of trying to just go back to Avignon, instead he goes to the chapel of St. Sophia and he thinks, I'll give the letter to Luca Pisano, the painter, right? And then what Cicciani can do is he can send his soldiers out there, bring back Luca and the letter together, and I'll have finished my mission. But when he gets to the chapel, no one there. So he finds that he is sick, right, which is a bad sign given that there's plague all around, but he just has a fever, and he lies in the chapel all night, sees the pictures on the walls, has hallucinations and feverish dreams and so on. And then when he gets up in the morning, he decides to read the letter, memorize it, hide it in the altar, and then go back to see Cicciani. All right. Then we jump to Julien's story. Marcel tells Julien that he read an article of his that is obviously about Manlius, and he says that he likes his ideas about Manlius, and he says like the troubles that Manlius and the Roman Empire were facing, he argues is very similar to the problems that France is facing from the Germans, remembering that the barbarians of Rome that were attacking the Romans were mostly from the region now known as Germany, right? It wasn't called Germany back then. Okay, so he tries to convince Julien that these two things are the same, these two situations are the same, and that he should help the government. He should help the occupied government, the government that is the puppet government of the Nazis, in order to defend civilization. Right? To try, even though the Germans have come in and they've taken over, he says, you can be there to try and save as much of it as you can. Right? Then we jump back to Olivier, right? Because remember, we noticed last time the way in which the characters and the story of Manlius and Julien have been focused on a lot more in part one. We're starting to see a lot more of Olivier's story unfolding for us. So Olivier returns to Avignon, and he finds that there are a group of flagellants, which is people who either are beating themselves, right? They think it's God's punishment upon them, and so they think that punishing themselves, right, for the things that they think they've done wrong, or in some cases they would each punish each other, right, is a way of solving this problem. I personally find that it's not a very good solution. I prefer to go to the doctor if I have a sickness, but flagellating yourself is one way of doing it, I guess. He sees them, and then he goes and he delivers the letter by memory to Cicciani, right? That's how he gets past the soldier. He doesn't have any letter on him, right? And he delivers the letter to Cicciani, and Cicciani says, good, right? I'm going to reward you for this service. And if you stick by me, you're going to really be very successful. Okay. Cicciani then tells Olivier to go and summon the leader of the flagellants, whose name is Peter. All right. Maybe there is a connection here somehow. To see Cicciani, and then while some of this is going on, while they're waiting for this, Olivier goes and he reads Manlius again. And he's increasingly, just like we saw Julien early on. Remember Julien in the first few pages of the novel, right? He says, Julien was confused by what he read about Manlius, because he said it was almost like there were two Manliuses, right? Remember this in the early, very first reading? He says, there's these two different Manliuses, and when Julien writes his article about Manlius, he tries to reconcile, and he tries to say, oh, it looks like there are two different sides, but he's really the same guy, same person. But Olivier is also having these kinds of problems, right? He's looking at this beautifully written essay, The Dream of Scipio. He's looking at all these sophisticated ideas, and yet he also knows the things that Gersonides has told him about Manlius. And so he asks this question: what sort of man can persecute others in the name of a faith he clearly does not profess? So he's like, why would Manlius do these things? I can't understand his motivations. Right? Can't understand why he would do these things. So Peter, the leader of the flagellants, he says, and remember we talked last time about how there is a high degree of hatred towards the Jews in this particular culture, and he says it's the Jews who've caused the plague, right? God is angry with us for allowing the Jews to live in our city, and so he blames them for the plague, right? And he says that the church isn't doing anything, and Chichani's like, well, let me see what I can do. Let me see how I can help you out. You help me, I'll help you. We'll use this situation to our advantage. We then jump back to the Manlius story, remembering that Manlius is the newest and most junior of the bishops, but he's also the most politically experienced of them. And he calls them together, even though he doesn't really have the authority in the church to do so, but he's supported by Bishop Faustus, who is a real historical figure, right? So Bishop Faustus of Riez. And he calls together the bishops, and they all have different desires. Some of them want to, they're being threatened by this guy, King Uric, right, who's a barbarian king, right, from the west. And he is currently, we're told, he is attacking the city of Clermont, which is where my sister was born, actually. So he's attacking this city, and they like, we should send an army, right? We should go send an army to Clermont, free the city, and we'll beat King Uric, right? Others want to have all sorts of different strategies, and Manlius says no. We've tried this before, right? We've tried to fight the barbarians. Every time we spend a huge amount of money, we raise an army, they go, they get defeated by the barbarians, and then we have nothing, right? We've spent all our money on trying to use this army to defend ourselves, and none of it works. So instead, he proposes that they go to see a different barbarian king in northeastern France called Gundobad. He says, let's make a deal with this guy, right? Instead of relying on Rome, instead of asking them for help, let's make our own deal with a different barbarian, right, who doesn't like King Uric and is more open to negotiation. Let's make a deal with him. After the meeting, we see Manlius gives a banquet, right, for all of the bishops, and he then tells of his own encounter when he went to Rome a few years earlier, right, when he was a young man, and there he met with Lord Ricimer, again, who is a real historical figure, right? And Lord Ricimer was, I believe he was half Roman and half German, right? So he was sort of part of his family background was he was Roman, that's why he was a Roman citizen, but also part of his background was that he was barbarian as well, right? And he was a very powerful ruler of basically the ruler of the army, of the military. So the emperors that ruled during the time of Ricimer, even though they were supposed to be in charge, they were really just his puppets, right? Because you can't be the emperor and then have someone else ruling the army, right? And someone else telling the army what to do and ignoring your orders, right? So the emperors that are referenced in our story, particularly Majorian, was one of these guys that was controlled by Ricimer. He was really the most powerful man in Rome. So when he meets Ricimer, Ricimer says, "Oh, you're a poet, huh? Impress me." And Manlius says, "I need time to prepare. I didn't do my homework. I swear I did, but I left it at home." Right? And then Ricimer says, "Well, you've got to be able to do it on the spot. If you're a politician, if you're a soldier, you have to be ready right then and there to fight or to make political decisions. Shouldn't a poet be able to make up poetry on the spot. And so Manlius remembers some lines from Horace, and he sort of copies, doesn't like copy them exactly, but he makes up his own lines like Horace's, and Reisman is like, oh, yeah, that's pretty good. Why don't you come have dinner with me? Right? So he impresses Reisman with his poetry and with his thinking, and he then goes to see Reisman, and the two of them discuss the decline of the Roman Empire, right? And remember, we saw that this has been a long-standing story within Rome, right? Is that we saw with the dream of Scipio, remember the Scipio characters, right? Those were real historical figures, Scipio Africanus and then Scipio the Younger, right? And they were from the Roman Republic, right? Remember, which is the system which ruled for several centuries before the Roman Empire, right? And the values and the culture and the politics and the whole system of the Roman Republic was seen by the Romans as a time of greatness, right? Those were like great men, great leaders, great heroes, right? And then, of course, we have the time of the early empire, when we have people like Julius Caesar and Caesar Augustus, right? Who, again, are seen as the greatness of Rome, right? Again, great leaders. And then Rome increasingly falls into decline. You have bad emperors like Nero and Caligula, right? They were still fairly strong leaders though, but they were pretty decadent, they're pretty awful in the things that they did, but increasingly over the centuries, the empire just becomes more and more and more weak and decadent, right? And they talk about this together, and Reisman comes to the conclusion that actually Rome is so weak and so decadent that it doesn't even want to defend itself anymore. It doesn't even care. It doesn't even care enough to protect itself from the barbarians, right? He's like, well, why would they let someone like me be in charge, a barbarian myself, if they really cared? And so Manlius uses this story, as I said, it says there, to convince the other bishops. They have to make an alliance with Gundobad, right? They have to make an alliance with the barbarians, because the barbarians are the only ones that are going to help them. This alliance is the only one that's going to help them, even though the barbarians are potentially their enemies. But Rome is not their friend. Rome only cares about Rome. It doesn't care about helping the rest of the empire. Okay, so that's where we are at in today's reading. So I want to pick out some important points from today's reading. And I want to begin with the very interesting example we're given of a kind of true friendship between Altia and Olivier. Now, this requires us to remember back to a couple of lessons ago when we looked at Aristotle, and in the Ethics, the Nicomachean Ethics, he lays down 3 kinds of friendship. What was the first kind? Friends based on use value, right? So if someone is useful to you, right? And we saw that Aristotle argues that we need these kinds of friends, but that kind of friendship doesn't last, right? It's not really a lasting kind of friendship. The second kind was based on interest is use value. Pleasure, right? So pleasure, so people that are fun to be around, they're fun to party with, they tell good jokes, they're good at drinking, whatever, right? They're fun to be around. So that kind of friendship that is based upon that foundation, also seen as only temporary by Aristotle, right? So use value, pleasure friendships, they're good, right? They're useful, they're important, but they are not the basis for a true friendship. True friendship was based instead upon what? The third kind. Virtue, by which Aristotle means the character, right? The character of the person, right? So if someone is like a bad person, a mean person, a nasty person, you're not going to want to be friends with that person, right? They're not going to make a good friend. Instead, you want to find someone who is a good person, someone that you like them for who they are, right? And because who we are doesn't really change with circumstances very much, right? It means it provides, Aristotle argues, for a more solid basis for friendship. Now, we see that this example, though, with Althea and Olivier is kind of complicated, isn't it? Right? Because on the one hand, are they useful to each other? Yeah, like given their jobs, right? Thinking about like what their positions are, they're about the most useful that they can be in terms of other people, right? So you're the main man for my enemy, right? You've got all sorts of knowledge and power and so on that is going to help me, and in turn that I would help you. So we see this in the way that Althea is able to actually tell Olivier, hey, watch out. My boss's soldiers are after you, right? That's pretty useful. Okay, so there is some use value involved here. Do they get pleasure from each other's company? Yes, right? Because we see that they're at this inn, or rather the monastery, which is functioning as like their sort of inn, the place for them to stay. They're at the monastery, enjoying each other's company, drinking, talking, right? Eating together. So clearly they have pleasure in each other's company, right? But we see also that beneath this, especially on Althea's side, is that they see each other as real friends, right? Beneath the use value, beneath the pleasure. But the situation is more complicated, right? Because remember, we see Althea, remember he's working for Cardinal Didot, the enemy of Ciccani. What was Cardinal Didot originally, how was he going to get the letter? Well, he wasn't necessarily going to kill him, but certainly he was going to send his soldiers after him and to bring back the letter whether Olivier is dead or alive, right? So he's like, I'm just going to send my soldiers, capture him, right, and get the letter that way, get it by force, in which Olivier's life would definitely be in danger. He could potentially be killed, right? So remember, Althea says to his boss, and he doesn't have to do this, right? He says to his boss, well, how about you let me try to get the letter from Olivier, right? And I'll try and like sneak it off him without putting his life in danger. And then if I can't do it, then the soldiers can get it from him, right? So we see here, like Althea doesn't have to do this, does he? Right? He doesn't have to try to protect Olivier, but he does it out of real friendship, right? So there's a strange kind of paradox here, because in this case, Althea is actually kind of, in one way, betraying his friend. He's going to steal the letter, is his plan. His plan is to steal the letter from Olivier during the night while he's asleep, and then go back to Cardinal Didot with the letter. Right? That's his plan, and he knows that if he does this, how is Olivier going to think of Althea if that plan had worked? Yeah, he's going to think, this guy pretended to be my friend. We drank together, we talked together, we had a meal together. I thought we were real friends, but obviously he was just using me to get to the letter, right? He knows that that's what Olivier is going to think of him if he steals the letter. But he does it anyway. Why does he do it? Well, he plans to do it anyway. Why does he want to? Right, so he cares enough about Olivier. He obviously feels real friendship for Olivier to the point where he is willing to give up their friendship, but in order to save his friend's life. Right? So you can see it's a curious contradiction, is that he has to prove his real friendship. He actually has to ruin the friendship to save his friend's life. Right? So you can see here, in this quotation. He actually thinks directly about this. And Altier tried to forget his last conversation with his master, the way, and this is Cardinal Didot, his master, the way he had begged for the opportunity to get this letter before the cardinal soldiers were let loose on his friend. Anything, even a sacrifice of his company to avoid bloodshed. But he knew that if he succeeded in his promise of taking it while Olivier slept and set off for Avignon long before his friend even awoke the next morning, then this would be the last night of their friendship. And he wished to revel in the conversation, the comfort of a true amity, right? Amity being friendship, right? So they're true friends, about to be sacrificed for the sake of that very friendship. Why would he even consider doing such a thing to Olivier if he did not love him, right? He really cares about Olivier. For the number of people who could talk of the things in which both men were interested was small. To lose such a friend would be a dreadful hurt. Right? So you can see here that this is one example, one small example that we have already of the kind of conflicts that we see that start to grow in the course of this story, in the course of this novel, right? Here, Altier is put in an almost impossible situation, right? Because on the one hand, he has to be loyal to the Cardinal Didot, right? That's his patron, it's his benefactor, that's his career, right? He has to help his benefactor, he has to help the cardinal. But on the other hand, he has this friend in Olivier. Which one does he choose? Does he choose to help the cardinal? Does he choose to help Olivier? And whichever one that he chooses to help, right? He's going to lose in some sort of way, isn't he? So we see him placed in this almost impossible position, and the only way that it gets resolved without him losing one of these things is that the plague intervenes, right? And so Altier ends up dying before he can steal the letter, dies of the plague, right? So this also has a curious effect on the way in which Olivier thinks about his friend, because Olivier still has no idea when Altier dies, he has no idea that Altier's plan was to steal the letter, right? So he just thinks, oh, my poor friend, he died of the plague. Right? This is terrible, right? And then he goes and out of respect, of course, he buries his friend himself. Okay. So one of the things that we saw both in Atonement and that we're seeing again in this novel is the way in which different perspectives and different readings of events lead to sometimes very contradictory kind of understandings of what things are and how things are, right? So we saw this in Atonement repeatedly. We saw there are various scenes in which things were misinterpreted because of the way in which they were presented or because of the limited knowledge and understanding of the characters. And we've also seen this previously in our own reading of The Dream of Scipio, where we saw things like the way in which Manlius has these two contradictory reputations. On the one hand, the great bishop, the great man of the church, the saint, right? And on the other, the secular man of learning, the poet, etc., right? Or Sophia, right? Sophia being, the Neoplatonist philosopher who doesn't believe in Christianity, or is very critical of certainly of Christians rather than Christianity itself, right? And then, what does she become? Saint Sophia, right? The very opposite of what she seemed to be, through a series of misunderstandings and misreadings of who she actually was, right? So that myth that comes up that she was somehow attached to Mary Magdalene and then made the journey to France and converted people in France, including Manlius, and that this chapel was dedicated to this Saint Sophia, right? So we see the same thing happening here again in regard to the monastery where Altier and Olivier were staying, right? we see it goes through a number of different transformations. So we see, first of all, that a monastery is a place of discipline, right? It's a place that is very specifically set out to promote a kind of order, right? Not only do everyone have to wear their uniforms, they follow a series of rules, right, for everyday conduct. Even the way in which a monastery is laid out, right, where the buildings are and everything, right, is all very carefully ordered. And yet we see that the plague brings with it this disorder, this chaos. Right? So the order and discipline of the monastery collapsed in minutes. 300 years of contemplation and prayer and blind obedience wiped out by terror. Nor did it ever recover. 3 of the 45 brothers survived, right? So that's how many people died in the plague. But they went elsewhere, and the building was abandoned for years before it was finally taken over by the Duke and used as stabling, right? So we see the way these things are like recycled, right, constantly. So it's a monastery, becomes abandoned by the plague, now it's a stable, right? In the 18th century, a fire in a pile of hay burned down most of it, and the depredations of builders removed much of the stone for new houses. Right? So now the stable burns down, they remove the stone, turn it into new houses. What remained was incorporated in 1882 into a school, a fine monument to the meritocratic ideals of republicanism. And this is a reference to the French Revolution. Right? The French Revolution happened like 100 years before this date, but nonetheless, its ideals were of democracy and tended to be a very secular kind of movement. So it promoted the state as the center of politics rather than the church. Right? So it's meant to be quite ironic that it would become something that was very religious as a monastery, then turned into stables, and then turned into a school that promotes secular values in this case, right? So these things are constantly, we see, transformed even into their opposites, just as Sophia was transformed from philosopher into saint. And then we see rather sweet conclusion to this. The spot where Olivier stood in the sunlight and where Altier died is now a favorite haunt of adolescent boys, right, from the school, it means. Who come here to smoke, right, because they're not supposed to. This is their secret place to go and smoke, when their lessons are over for the morning. Wildflowers grow where Olivier buried his friend. Tipping him into the grave, he dug himself, saying a brief prayer in farewell and promising to have a mass said for him when he could find a priest to say it. They are picked every year, and the boys give them to their girlfriends of the moment. Right? So there's a kind of circle here insofar as like we see this place of burial was originally a place of like friendship, right? And then we see the wildflowers grow on it, and now like obviously the wildflowers are then given to the girlfriends who are love, friendship, etc. Right? So there are these historical transformations, recyclings, as we see in this case of a building, but we've already seen the way in which not just buildings and physical things are recycled, but also ideas and practices and religious ideas and so on, constantly throughout this. Now, again, this can lead to some very bad misreadings, and one of them we see occurs in the speech that Marcel gives to Julien, right? Now, who were the enemies in World War II? Germany was the central force of it, right? And they banded together with Italy and Japan, right? So they were the 3 main countries that were being fought against by the Allies, right? And who won? Did Germany win? No, right? But remember, when Marcel is giving this speech, it's still early in the war, right? Still relatively early in the war. And were the Allies always winning? No, right? Especially early in the war. Remember, we saw in Atonement in Part 2, right? We saw that the Allies were losing very badly, right, in those early parts of the war. Right? So we saw, Robbie, as he's going to Dunkirk, that was a huge retreat that was happening because the Germans had come in and they had easily defeated France. Okay? So at this stage of the war, it appears to everyone, or to many people, that the Germans, they're unstoppable, right? They have this great war machine, they're very efficient, they're very powerful, they swept aside the French like nothing else, like as if they were just a mosquito in the way, right? And so this is what Marcel says to Julien. He says, this is how it's going to be from now on. We are in a new world, one which has changed forever. The Germans have won so comprehensively that they cannot now be defeated. Right? No way that the Germans could lose. There is no one left to fight them. They have complete control over Europe. So he's saying this, we're not given the exact time that he's saying this, but we're guessing around 1940, 1941, right? And remembering from the very first sentence of the novel that Julien dies in 1943, right? So here we see that Marcel has this perspective that because we have the benefit of hindsight, we know how things end. We know how the World War II turns out, right? So it's easy for us to say, oh yeah, well, of course we know that the Germans are going to eventually lose, right? But at the time, right, at the time that Marcel is saying this, he really believes this, right? He really thinks, yeah, Germans have won. This is it. This is the new conditions under which we live, right? Just as we saw with Manlius saying, look, Rome isn't going to help us. We have to side with the barbarians, right? We have to think of ourselves as being allies of the barbarians. It's just how it is. There's no other way of doing it, right? So this is very important because he at the time, with the knowledge that he has, the way in which he's thinking, what he's seeing around him, he really believes that this is how it is. The Germans are in control. They will be the new force of the century. Of course, we know with hindsight that he was wrong. But this is something about history that happens over and over, is that we think, oh, what it is like now, oh, this is how it will always be, right? This is how conditions always be like this. Even though Ian Pears shows us over and over again, like with these historical transformations that we see in the monastery, that actually the way in which history works is very unexpected. It can transform things very quickly in ways that we don't expect and would never have expected in some circumstances, right? That a monastery would become a stable, would become a school, and that all these different transformations would happen, or that Sophia would become Saint Sophia, right? All those things. We just can't expect them. We can't know that they would happen. Okay. And then to my final point for today is a very tricky question that both Manlius and Julien are facing, which is this question, is it possible to defend civilization? Right? Is it possible to defend civilization? Okay. Now, we see here that, and I'm going to look first of all at Olivier, that Olivier is contemplating this question through the contradictions that he sees in Manlius, right? And Manlius, we're starting to see that he is having to make some very tough decisions, right? Does he follow his ideals, the things that he wants to be like, both as a person and as a society? Or does he work with the reality of what he has, right? Remembering that, like, Manlius doesn't want to join with the barbarians. He wants to be part of Rome, right? He identifies with Roman culture and Roman civilization. He doesn't want to join the barbarians, but political necessity means that he feels like he has to make a decision in this direction, right? He has to join forces with the barbarians, right? What he wants is to be part of the Roman Empire, to be part of, this civilized world. But he, out of political necessity, feels like he has to join with the barbarians. Right? And so Olivier is trying to reconcile these two things in his head. Right? How can someone, on the one hand, believe something over here, and yet at the same time do something that appears to be the opposite of what they believe? Right? So we'll see that this works not only in one direction, but in the other direction. Sometimes you can believe in good things and do bad things for the sake of political necessity. But sometimes we'll also see, and particularly with Pope Clement later on, is that you can also believe in bad things and still end up doing things that are good, right? But not for good reasons, right? So we'll see, we'll come back to that as we go on. So let's see this quote. Olivier puzzling through these questions. So Olivier retired to the gatehouse and passed the next 3 hours working hard, reading the manuscripts that Gersonides had lent him, rereading his own ever more confusing document by Manlius Hippomenes. The contrast appealed to him. The limpid, clear thought of Manlius, the confused, noisy outpourings of the flagellants told him much, suggested to him why the old Roman had written these words. For the first time, he picked up and truly understood the tone of regret, the fear in the text, how Manlius must have intended this work to be a bastion against the darkness of ignorance and a valedictory to an age he knew was dying all around him. But he remembered also Gersonides' words at the meeting when he had tentatively suggested that his assault on the Jews of Vaison might have been motivated by faith, that is, Manlius' attack on the Jews of Vaison. Oh, but this man was no Christian when he wrote this. This is Gersonides' conclusion. Oh, but this man was no Christian when he wrote this, and he was a bishop, as you say. So go and think yet again, what sort of man, and this is really quite crucial, what sort of man can persecute others in the name of a faith he clearly does not possess? Right? And again, we see this kind of question asked about, like, the politics that we see at work in the novel. Right? Think about this with regard to Ciccani. Right? Ciccani, whom does he meet with in our reading today? Who does he has a meeting with someone, right? With Peter, the leader of the flagellants, and they hate the Jews. The flagellants, they blame the Jews. Does Ciccani hate Jews? No, he doesn't, right? Obviously, he has to follow the rules about, like, not associating with them too closely, or any of those sorts of things. But he's the one that sends Olivier to Gersonides, who is a Jewish scholar. Right? So clearly, Ciccani doesn't hate the Jews, but in making the deal with Peter, he's saying, oh yeah, I'm willing to use the Jews. I'm willing to persecute them for my own political ends. Right? So he doesn't hate them, right? He doesn't hate the Jews himself, but he's willing to use other people's hatred for his own ends, right? So similarly, the same kind of questioning is being asked about Manlius. What kind of guy would persecute some people, would do these things, would do these terrible things that Olivier is reading about, and yet at the same time, Manlius also doesn't seem to actually hate the Jews or believe in the ideals that he's like supposedly associated with as a bishop, right? So this is what Olivier and Julian later on are trying to reconcile in their minds, right? It's like, how is it you could have this one set of ideals, right, that you seem to really believe is a central part of your beliefs, and yet you can do something else so terrible over here in your practical decisions. Secondly, we also come to the question about, well, can you defend something? Can you defend something if it doesn't want to really be defended, right? In other words, sometimes defending things can actually destroy them to the point where, like, winning a war becomes pointless, right? It's what's known in as after a famous Greek king who lost a war. Well, he won the war, but he lost everything in the process. His name was Pyrrhus, right? So he won the battles, but he basically lost all of his soldiers and all of his money and everything in the process of winning. So he's like, well, I might as well have lost, right? So we call this a Pyrrhic victory after King Pyrrhus, right? A Pyrrhic victory is where technically you win, but you lose so much in the process of winning that you basically have also lost, right? So Manlius is pointing out, we want to make sure that we don't end up in fighting the barbarians, we don't end up with one of those Pyrrhic victories, right? So Manlius, he's saying we don't want a Pyrrhic victory. We don't want a victory where we might beat the barbarians, but we destroy all of our lands. We kill off all our soldiers. We lose all our peasants. Then what's the point of winning, right? So here he says to the other bishops, "You must bear in mind," said Manlius with as much restraint as he could manage, "that any army is likely to cause more damage and chaos than it prevents. I do not know much yet about the finances of the church, but I know something of the tax revenues, and I can tell you that this whole region will be strained to pay for just one campaign. Any more than that, and there will be precious little worth left defending." Right? So there are a number of questions that are asked about this problem of, like, how does a society defend itself? Well, first of all, we see that Reisimus says, well, it has to want to defend itself, right? It has to be healthy enough to want to defend itself. It has to care about itself enough. And we see that Rome in his time doesn't. Rome doesn't care anymore, right? It doesn't care about defending itself, doesn't care about defending its borders or anything like that, right? But we also see that there is a kind of a game of, like, making sure that you preserve something to be defended, right? If you're going to fight to defend your society, you have to make sure that in making that fight, you don't lose everything, right? You don't lose everything of value, so that there's still something worth fighting for here, right? So what we see the bishops are concerned about, this is one of the historical ironies that Ian Pears is playing with, is that they're worried that if they join up with the barbarians, right, if they make this deal with Gundobad, well, they're like, aren't we going to become barbarians ourselves, right? Aren't we going to destroy the civilization that we believe in and that we follow if we become just like them, if they become our friends? And so Manlius says, well, you don't really have a choice, right? Because already you're going to face either joining up with them or being conquered by them. Choose. Right. Okay, let's leave it there for today. Please hand in your prep sheets as you go, and I'll see you next time. Thank you.